Welcome everyone to our Wan Hai Hotel program today. And the program is organized monthly in conjunction with our Wan Hai Hotel exhibition downstairs, and also artist Ringdon Johnson's exhibition, Best Synthetic Answer, upstairs. And these two exhibitions, as well as the program, forms as a part of Rockbound Art Museum's ongoing inquiry into complex geographies. And my name is Joan Yuzu. I am the head of programs and research here at the museum. And I'd like to provide you with a little bit of a context of our inquiry into complex geographies in this fall program. So to exist as Shanghai, as we know, the name Shanghai translates literally as upper sea, and is to be born of rivers and seas. And at the center of Wan Hai Hotel lies the expansive vision of Tonga thinker Epeli Hoafa, who defies the reduction of the Pacific to islands in far sea. And here, his seal of islands manifests a boundless expansion of continuity, shared histories, and flowing networks, rather than isolated territories. Hence, we are taking a name from a humble Chinatown hotel, Penang, Malaysia, Wan Hai Hotel, to reactivate the connectivity tissues of a global Chinatown network, and also a loose constellation that is unconfined by national boundaries. So today's program, Indigenous Oceanic Resilience, is the third programmatic gathering at Wan Hai Hotel. It offers indigenous resilience and historical connectivities in the face of impending climate catastrophe. We'll start with a lecture, Wanua, towards a language of oceanic civilization by historian Manimporok, who will be examining the northern part of Sulawesi in Indonesia, where the Tondano people formed an important yet understudied link between oceans and mountains in the history of the Western Pacific. And this is not a story of increasing historical interconnectedness facilitated by quote-unquote globalization, but rather one that emphasizes decolonial and indigenous relationality. The word Wanua in the vanishing Tondanese language will be served as an entry point. And by zooming in on the history of this word and the lived experience with which it is associated with, the talk will be presenting an oceanic pan-indigenous civilization that connected geographically disparate areas even before the arrival of modern European empires. And after the talk, at 4 o'clock, we have a documentary performance by artist duo Celestine and Nova, who will be confirming all the wildness of the sea through the sailing project and performance space, and also a community platform, Aka Kinari, which the work is also being shown downstairs in the exhibition on our ground floor. So after the talk, please do stay for the performance at 4 o'clock. And before I welcome Manimporok to the stage, I would like to provide you with some biographic parameters. Manimporok is a postdoctoral teaching fellow at Global Perspectives on Society at NYU in Shanghai. He is a historian specializing in multilingual archival research and transnational approaches to the Western Pacific, covering East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia, circa 1600 to 1900s. Manimporok earned his doctor in philosophy in history from the University of Oxford and previously held a postdoctoral position at Brown University in East Asian Studies and Colgate Institute for the Humanities. And one of his current research projects is the history of Arafura Zone, which was an oceanic space of transnational coexistence and solidarity. A radical social experiment that historically valorizes non-state forms of organizations and intellectual life. He is also working on a project that takes a critical indigenous studies approach to the history of Southeast Asia, which involves a language revitalization project for a moribund language spoken in northern Sulawesi. Welcome, Manimporok.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. So the other day, I was walking around in Pudong and close to the newly opened greenhouse there, and there's a little lake there, right? And I sat there, staring into the abyss hopelessly, and I stared slightly too long. And it was a windy day, and so there were ripples over the water's surface, and they made all these like beautiful patterns. But for those of you who've done that, also maybe in the past, you'll know that if you do that for too long, and you shift your focus back onto the land or the deck of the ship, then you'll see everything in your field of view moving, right? Everything that you intuitively know to be in a fixed space, a fixed spot in space and time will be moving all over the place, and it's kind of a dizzying effect. So people call this the motion after effect, and it's supposed to be an optical illusion. But I want to raise the possibility today that maybe this might also be understood as a form of reality from which we have been completely alienated in our present-day world. A kind of reality where everything is in flux and nothing can be pinned down to a specific place or time. And I think this idea, there's a word for this in the languages of the Pacific, and the word is Wanua. So not many people know about this word anymore, including many people from the Pacific. And this has to do with the long history of colonialism and globalization and the erasure of local cultures over the past 500 years. So I'm recovering this concept as part of a project of language revitalization. And today I want to give you a preview of this project, which will in the near future become a book on indigenous knowledge systems and the way in which they might be able to help us think through contemporary crises to do with climate change, with social justice, but also crisis in general as a modern human phenomenon and a natural phenomenon not bound to humans alone. So this project builds on my father's work to revitalize the language of the Tondano people in Sulawesi in Indonesia, which he began sometime in the 1970s when he first encountered a newspaper article about an indigenous group and the loss of its language to the forces of globalization. He started collecting words and then compiling them into a list. And he was doing this as he was working in a factory on a shipyard in Rotterdam. So fast forward 5 decades, and I'm sitting at the dining table with my father and stepmother, working on finishing the latest version of this dictionary. And my job is to assist in transforming this dictionary into a Tondanese to English and English to Tondanese version. So a previous version had already been published from Tondanese to Malay, Manadonese Malay. That's a Creole that's spoken in eastern Indonesia, and then into Indonesian. So it's a trilingual dictionary. But now the aim was to turn it into an English dictionary. And this turned out to be a kind of a rather violent process. So I had just burst into the room, impatiently trying to pin down the Tondanese equivalent of the word knowledge in English. And at the time I thought I was trying to make sure that the word had a stable form and was consistently used in the same way, by comparing the word noted in the dictionary with what I heard coming out of the mouths of these native speakers of the language. In retrospect, though, I think I was just taking out my frustrations The project had long felt like a burden to me. The dictionary was just one of many projects that my father asked me for help for, ever since I remember being able to be of assistance. And that memory is the product of a calculation, an ongoing process through which I measure how much of my time I have spent and how much more I receive in return. I could locate the beginning of this process of becoming something called Homo economicus in my own lifetime as a child of a first-generation immigrants to the global north. I could locate it within my father's own lifetime, whose personal history led him to remind me that it's okay to rely on the Dutch social security net as reparations for centuries of colonialism in the West. Or that of my stepmother, who is washing the dishes as she corrects my father's Tondanese. She does so happily, because as my father reminds her, she's better off than she was in the third world. And I could descend further down the family tree, all the way down into the roots and the soil. I could examine the surrounding air or the raindrops that it transports from elsewhere in search of the first term of that equation. And that's what I want to do here with you today, because I think an investigation like this might be useful for other indigenous communities and anyone else interested in questions to do with language vitality, specifically in relation to Oceania. So I want to start by talking about a problem that I noticed in the process of working on the dictionary. Now, language revitalization efforts generally follow what I would informally call a UNESCO approach. This is an approach that essentially understands the vitality of a language in terms of its usefulness in a modern, globalized, and industrialized world. If a language is considered endangered, so everything from at risk and below that in this schema, it's because it's being replaced by languages that are understood locally as being more useful in this modern, globalized, and industrialized world. Now, the UNESCO approach to language revitalization projects seems doomed from the very beginning, as indigenous folks have been forced to rely on the modern, globalized, and industrialized world for their livelihoods since colonial times. Actually, according to the implicit definition of language within this approach, the pre-endangered indigenous languages of Oceania and their associated cultures themselves are necessarily already colonial products. So I'm going to concretely explain what I mean by that. So the Tondano language is a language spoken around the Tondano Lake on the northern tip of Sulawesi in Indonesia, one of several indigenous languages spoken on the peninsula. And this is a mountainous place that came to be known as Minahasa. So Minahasa means unity in the indigenous languages. Unity. And although the word is of indigenous origin, the unity to which the word refers to is largely a colonial construct. So in 1679, villages of the uplands of northern Sulawesi signed a treaty with the Dutch East India Company through which they would receive military support against the King of Bolang. This was a local ruler who was based on the coast and who was supposedly a long-time enemy of some of the upland villages. Now, for the Dutch, the treaty was part of a larger plan to acquire rice for their garrisons and campaigns on nearby islands. They were busy monopolizing the spice trade there, focusing mostly on nutmeg, which only grew on specific islands in eastern Indonesia. So that was the agenda, the hidden agenda behind the offer of military support against the constructed common enemy. And the King of Bolang was initially the one who sold indigenous rice to the Dutch, and before them, the Spanish. The treaty allowed the Dutch to cut out the middleman. So by drawing this border here, you can see down there, Bolang Mongondo, that's the area, let's say, of the King of Bolang. And in the process, existing connections between the peninsula and the rest of the island of Sulawesi and the rest of the oceanic world were severed. So the treaty itself states that in exchange for protection, the village chiefs promised to recognize the Dutch East India Company as overlord for all eternity and supply the company with free materials and labor among several other conditions. So this seems like a pretty bad deal. But the natives still signed the treaty. So to understand how this could happen, we need to consider that the natives as understood by the Dutch were not necessarily the natives as understood by the natives. In the treaty, the Dutch addressed the village chiefs who were supposed to represent the whole community of the region of Manado. And their agreement meant, to the Dutch at least, that the treaty would also apply to anyone who wasn't present. So besides the obvious problem that the whole community was not part of the negotiation, neither the village chiefs nor the regional community nor the village as conceived of by the Dutch were an indigenous given. So those who answered the call ended up becoming chiefs in an enduring and unprecedented way, receiving special privileges that generated new forms of prestige. And these in turn transformed existing relations between the natives, creating a division between natives 1 and natives 2, 3, 4, etc. And one important consequence here is that it tipped the scales in favor of the creation of a social system that seems inspired by European monarchical models. The chiefs essentially became lower-ranking elites in a nested colonial relationship, a kind of indigenous nobility. So the word Minahasa was used by these indigenous chiefs to refer to meetings with the Dutch, but gradually it became the name of the geographical area that these indigenous dukes and barons would oversee. And this came with land claims associated with specific family names. So some indigenous actors had something to gain by signing the treaty, and the translators who actually translated the contents of the treaty from Malay, which was a commonly used inter-island language at the time, into the local languages. They already benefited from the relationship with the Dutch colonial actors. Now there's this concept of the stranger king. This has been helpful in understanding this kind of political dynamic between colonial actors and indigenous actors. And the idea is that indigenous people would use colonial actors strategically in their own internal power struggles among their own factions. So Dutch colonial actors were embraced as stranger kings in order to solve immediate political problems. But there was an assumption that they could be deposed as soon as they no longer fulfilled that function. So while this may have been true for the groups that would later come to be seen as the Minahasan tribes, others, natives 2, 3, 4, etc., were not playing the same game at all. And so these other groups were gradually excluded from politics, partly because of the colonial intervention. And they included, and this is an important point, they included Valian, status-bearing women, some often called shamans in other contexts. And so what resulted was a very specific form of social organization that we now understand as tribe. People came to be bound to each other and the soil on which they were to cultivate rice, and then coffee, and then cloves, coconut oil, and today, palm oil. Where possible, colonial actors restricted the movements of these people in a way that maximized the amount of labor that they could take from them. And it's not as if they could get away with that easily. So there were attempts to change the social structure, but they were met with excessive violence. So in the years, decades, and centuries after the Treaty of 1679, these coercive social structures affected the language spoken, the customs observed, and the history remembered. They slowly gave rise to what is now understood as the Minahasan ethnic subgroups, Tombulu, Tontemboan, Tonsea, and Tondano. So a missionary work assisted this work of the colonial bureaucracy. In the 19th century, missionaries of the Dutch Missionary Society began to take a serious interest in the study of the local cultures. And they believed that a good understanding of local languages, customs, and histories was crucial in the work of conversion. What they didn't realize, however, is how their own understandings about human sociality and culture shaped the objects of their study. So study of the true Minahasan languages of Tontemboan, Tombulu, Tonsea, and Tondano got underway right around the time that the nation was being conjured into existence in Europe. And the missionaries, they used the nation along with concepts of common language, folk customs, and history as a lens through which they interpreted the words spoken at the particular moments and places in which they were working. And they thought that they saw an original culture free from influence from the West that was rapidly disappearing. And this was very welcome in the case of traditional headhunting practices, which are not traditional at all, but it's kind of like a reaction to this coercive social structure that the colonial actors created. But they were sad about the disappearance of things such as language. But actually, the loss of Minahasan languages was not something that simply happened to Minahasans, as if they were helpless victims of modernizing and globalizing forces. So by the 1930s, my grandmother and grandfather still spoke Tondanese and several other of the indigenous languages with each other and their peers. But they never spoke those languages with their children, choosing to speak Malay and Dutch with them instead. Now, some see that decision as an attempt by Minahasans to climb the social ladder available to natives within the Dutch colonial empire. By learning the language, they could become the policemen, the tax collectors, the school teachers, and other managers of the Dutch colonial apparatus. On the slide here, you see the last chief of Tondano and his family. And here on the slide, on the right-hand side, you see his daughter, who's a school teacher and also a walian, so a female shaman, and who is also my grandmother. There was this one time when she was robbed, my father recalls, and so somebody took her bag, and then my father witnessed her coming back home and taking out a plate and then putting a sort of like, what's it called? So putting a little bit of water onto the plate so that it creates a surface. And so in this divination ritual, she could see in the ripples who took her paycheck. So this is an example of how the colonial system changed the way indigenous knowledge was used. To bring justice to those who were entitled to certain material rewards by the colonial regime. At the same time, however, my grandmother carried memories of a world where things could be different. Every year on the 5th of August, she would take my father to the graveyard to commemorate the life of Dotu Matulandi, an ancestor who helped survivors of what is locally known as the Tondano War. He helped them flee to the other side of the Tondano Lake, where they hid in a new settlement close to the village of Kakas. The war was an event in which several chiefs swore an allegiance to rise up against the Dutch and drive them out, and this had disastrous consequences. You see here remnants of the fortifications of this Tondano War. So some local historians call this the Second Tondano War. For others, it's the third. But the closer we look as historians, as archaeologists, as anthropologists, the more this number seems to multiply. So calling it a war was actually an intellectual move by somebody called El Mangindaan, and he was the first Minahasan to study in the Netherlands. It was a move through which he tried to communicate in a language that would make sense to the colonizer, a much longer history of non-cooperation and a desire for social transformation that began with the smallest acts of foot dragging and ended in open rebellion. So written in perfect Dutch and published in this renowned journal that exists up until today, this auto-ethnographic act was itself part of a radical social transformation that many Minahasans dreamed of by the late 19th century. Now, Dotu Matulandi's grave stood out to my father because of the discrepancy between its appearance and what he was told that it stood for. So it was made of 4 pieces of dolomite that bore no inscription. And the reason for this discrepancy, his mother would tell him, is that the Dutch colonial government forbade any form of remembrance of the Tondano War. And as part of this agenda, the colonial government issued an order to village chiefs of the Tondano area to bury Dotu Matulandi unceremoniously at the time of his death. And this act of historical erasure marked the beginning of an especially severe period of exploitation to which the Dutch colonial government subjected Minahasa, particularly in relation to the cultivation of coffee. But this attempt to make people forget past efforts at reimagining social reality did not really succeed. Knowledge of the location of Dotu Matulandi's grave was passed on from one generation to the next, as was the significance of the Tondano War in the face of everyday forms of colonial oppression. Now, the war, both literally and figuratively speaking, reminded people that a transformation of colonial conditions could not be achieved through physical force. In the following decades, this awareness motivated indigenous actors to seek alternative paths to greater autonomy and freedom, ones that were thought to lead to change, but did not go so far as to provoke the Dutch to burn down villages. And one avenue was civilization, but not really one that aligned with European definitions of the concept of civilization, because that concept doesn't include the culture of the natives. Missionaries established the first schools in the region, but it was actually the indigenous students and their voracious appetite for education that led to the establishment of a region-wide network of schools that actually became the most comprehensive school system in the Dutch East Indies. And this development followed a wave of conversions to Christianity, which practically happened in the absence of the colonizer. So missionaries were very proud of how many people had turned to Christianity in this area, but actually, for many indigenous actors, Christianity was something else entirely. They danced in the church and they did things that they weren't supposed to do in the space. It was a kind of liberation theology. Colonial actors, they chose Malay as the language of instruction within schools for natives, but within several decades after schools were first established, we see the appearance of people such as Bangindaan, the person I mentioned earlier, or another person called Waworuntu, who somehow possessed perfect command over the Dutch language. Now, this person, Waworuntu, was the first native within this part of the Dutch Empire to march up to the Governor General to submit a petition on behalf of the Minahasan people. And the petition tried to change the horrendous social conditions produced by the coffee industry. Although the colonial authorities were reluctant to speak to him in Dutch, and they kept addressing him in Malay, they couldn't really ignore the petition because of this important link that he constituted, this important role that he played between the indigenous population and the Dutch colonial government. So as a result, the Dutch colonial government reluctantly organized an investigative tour of the Minahasa. And once there, the investigator was bombarded with written complaints coming from all layers of indigenous society, from commoners to elites. So there's this historian, Mika Schouten, and she observed that Minahasans showed that they had learned to use a weapon that the Dutch themselves had delivered to them, namely literacy. But I want to emphasize that literacy and proficiency in Dutch was not an intended product of colonial education, but the result of indigenous assertiveness to change the cards that they were dealt. So my grandmother and grandfather's decision to stop transmission of the languages of the Tondano and Tontemboan in favor of the transmission of was a conscious one. It was a striving toward greater freedom and autonomy to the extent that this was possible within the coercive structures established by Dutch colonial actors. And it happened in many homes across the peninsula, and as a result, it left languages such as Tondanese to this day in a state of dying, in a state of moribundity, according to the UNESCO framework. Technically, that is, because there are not enough advocates for the language to be registered under this United Nations scheme. But just as Minahasan actors turned away from indigenous languages in pursuit of freedom, another understanding of the concept of language began to take root among other Minahasans. The concept of language that lay at the basis for the rise of the first European nationalisms. Other people, again, simply continued using and passing on the indigenous languages to their children, reserving the use of Manadonese Malay for intertribal encounters and Dutch for matters to do with the colonial government. So my father here on the photos, he grew up at the intersection of these three attitudes towards the indigenous languages. At home, the indigenous languages became a relic of a bygone era. Next door, the indigenous languages promised a post-colonial future. And outside the home, in the kampung, the indigenous language facilitated conviviality in the form of soccer and kite fighting. So somewhere between the arrival of Japanese armed forces in 1942 and the immediate years after the Dutch gave up sovereignty to the Republic of the United States of Indonesia, that's not the name of the country today, Minahasan nationalism had deeply shaped my dad's subjectivity, affecting his ideas about language along the lines of this nationalistic attitude. In other words, my father would come to see the indigenous languages as an avenue leading to a national self-determination project. This was against the backdrop of the failure to form the Federated States of Indonesia and the Cold War. And these kinds of emerging micro-nationalisms became prime targets for US and Soviet Union geopolitical interventions. It fueled my dad's participation in a political movement for greater economic equality within the non-federated Republic of Indonesia that turned into a bloody CIA-backed insurgency against Sukarno that has been conveniently forgotten. As a rather popular young man among Minahasan youth in post-independence Jakarta, partly because of his involvement in this mutual aid group called Manguni, what some would call a gang or a vigilante group, my father was asked by one of the leaders of the movement to assist in the organization of the siege of the capital city. So each of the groups involved in this operation received a name according to natural features of Minahasan geography. And the infantry group was supposed to capture the palace, Jakarta, was called Manimporok. And Manimporok had at this point in history transformed from a mountain into a weapon in the political struggle of a nation. So after the eventual collapse of the whole movement and the granting of amnesty by the Sukarno regime, and there was a kind of further subtle economic discrimination towards outer island regions such as Minahasa and eastern Indonesia by the center. So that's by Indonesia. And so my father moved to the Netherlands in the hopes of a better future. And that's where I was born and given this name, Manimporok. So what in my father was once a striving towards greater self-determination within the post-colonial nation-state of Indonesia had at this point distilled down into a more subdued form of cultural nationalism. And that same spirit led my father to give me this particular name, and it led him to study genealogy, the kind of story of his own background, and his language revitalization project, and also participation in all kinds of diasporic support groups. And all of this assisted in coping with the various and enduring forms of oppression, economic, social, mental, that these former colonial subjects were facing in these new worlds of the empires that are no longer empires. And at the end of the day, however, the ultimate goal of those projects seemed to be the birth of a new nation state within a larger system of more powerful nation states, or better integration into already existing nation states. So this is where I would like to turn to the word I introduced in the beginning, Wanua. The Minahasan diasporic support groups, which can be found all over the world, are called Mapalus Kawanua. And this word Kawanua forms a direct link to the Treaty of 1679, the moment when the Dutch would forever transform the place we now know as Minahasa and sever it from its connections to the rest of the oceanic world. Now the Ka in Kawanua denotes possession. And Wanua itself is best translated as world. But in the form of Kawanua, people understand it in the diaspora as my kin or my people. It's a way of showing solidarity or communicating solidarity between people who have this shared history of being colonized 3 or 4 times, firstly by the Dutch, then Japanese, then Indonesia itself, and if you agree with me, by the Minahasans themselves at an earlier point in history. So through this possessive particle, ka, the world of Wanua is reduced to an indicator of nationality, but an unrecognized one. But Wanua itself was never the sole possession of a single people. Throughout the oceanic world, we see it recur among various local languages and local histories. So you see it in the Maori Declaration of Independence. You see it in the ritual spaces called Banua in Bali. It's even in the name Vanuatu in one of the oceanic countries. And the usage varies a little bit depending on the place across this disparate, complex geography. But all over the place, Wanua seems to have been used as a way to lay claim over a world in which claiming things was not customary. So in other words, it refers to a world where the concept of possession or private property does not exist. And this concept expresses itself in almost all officially recognized national languages of today's world, starting with the existence of the possessive particle or other grammatical rules that can indicate possession. And these languages, in turn, might be understood as being part of one big language family, the language family of agricultural and industrial civilization. So there's a field of study that tries to reconstruct this language family and trace its roots to the supposedly first language spoken by Homo sapiens. That is called Nostratic. They call it Nostratic. And the word Wanua is seen within that field of study as part of the language of Australasia, a hypothetical proto-nation from which almost all Southeast Asians and Oceanians are supposedly descended. And so here we begin to see more of the theoretical apparatus behind what I earlier called the UNESCO approach to language revitalization. It's a taxonomic scheme in which a word like Wanua belongs to a social unit that belongs to a specific part of the earth. In other words, a naming system that territorializes the earth and its associated forms of life. I'm talking about a knowledge system in which the concept of possession is baked into every aspect of reality, from the way in which we relate to each other and to the environment, to the grammatical constructs that we use and other linguistic elements that we use to communicate about this reality, and possibly all the way down to the perceived structure of reality itself. A system of knowledge in which there are such things as objects that have no will of their own, and which can then be possessed by subjects that do have a will of their own. So back in 1679, when certain Minahasans signed the treaty with the Dutch, there was one particular thing that they had in common. One of the most trusted sources of Minahasan history notes how indigenous men initially sought contact with the Dutch because Spanish men could not keep their hands from the indigenous women. Possessiveness with regards to female bodies was intricately intertwined with stranger king politics. Marriages could be mobilized in the formation of alliances and the retention of material privileges within exclusive and elite circles. So we know that a spirit of patriarchy facilitated relations between certain indigenous men and colonial actors because of the reference of the tribe of Tonkimbut in the Treaty of 1679. Tonkimbut means people of the vagina. So you might be able to guess that this was not a name that used by Tonkimbuts themselves. This was often the case with tribe names, actually. They are often names given to them by others. And it wasn't unusual for them to be derogatory or meant derogatorily, so with intention of being derogatory. So from other sources, we also know that there was an indigenous group at this time in which the most authoritative positions were reserved for women. And these women were never part of the treaty negotiation. So it's perhaps not a coincidence that both the documentary record and oral traditions never mention the existence of a female chief. And the introduction of the village chief system itself constituted a permanent political shift in favor of certain men. Men who were seeking allies and willing to name things for their own political agendas. Now, another related act of naming preceded this, when Natives 1 gave permission to Natives 3 to live around the lake. And the people who came to be known as the Tondano people, that were them. These were actually migrants from other parts of Oceania, but they were locked into the Minahasa area even before the colonial encounter. And they came to be known as the slaves of the Tonsea people. So over time, with the help of European colonizers, this area solidified into a race of rice farmers, coffee cultivators, and now palm oil milkers, part of an international division of labor mapped onto territorial units that persist until this very day. But vague memories of a different world remain in the traces of a word such as Wanua, which was once used across the bodies of water in Oceania. A word that suggests the fluidity and ever-changing nature of indigenous worlds, something that is not tied to the land, unlike this nation and state-centric social order of today's world, which at the end of the day is a world of an agricultural and industrial civilization. And considering the environmental and social crisis that we face today, it's a dying one. It's a dying civilization. So the point I'm trying to make is that if we are to pursue language revitalization, it should be just as much about the recovery of otherworldly concepts, such as Wanua, where the concept where there's no a world where there's no possession, no form of possession, and that can actually happen in any language. So we should make sure to do these language revitalization projects in such a way as to do it for the living. And in Wanua, that would mean the entirety of the planet, from rocks to humans and everything in between, and beyond. That's it for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Manimporok. I thought that was so aptly connected to what we are looking at today in terms of our Indigenous Oceanic Resilience, and also what introduction that we talked about, looking at the whole region, the Pacific region, as a whole sea rather than small islands within the sea. And before we open to the floor, and I would love to encourage the audience to start thinking about questions, I would also love to connect to the space that we are sitting within. And as you were talking about your father looking at the language, Tondano language, and thinking this is either a representation of a bygone era, but also it can also mean a post-colonial future. The kind of past and future relationship that your father was thinking, it's very fitting in this space that we are sitting, which is designed by Singaporean artist Ming Wan, and he is envisioning this space as a connective pocket where we're connecting the past and the future together. So for the audience who haven't been to the space before, what you can see on the panel next to you, these are spaceship interior taken from Andrei Tarkovsky's films. And at the back, these are Buddhist motifs that is taken from Chinese ancient cave. So the idea for us to house lectures and performances and gatherings in this space is also to connect our histories together with present, and also looking into the future at the same time. So thank you so much for this lecture. And yeah, I would love to hand the mic to audience if anybody has any question. Yeah.
I can just shout. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. I really like the part where you talk about how the Dutch language, in ways, they teach Malay in school, but in ways that they use literacy as a sort of defense mechanism. My question is also kind of, kind of reflecting back at the space we're in. We're talking about this kind of power of the linguistic, how different languages shape the way we understand things, and how the Wanam language, the word itself provides such a beautiful lens to look at that history. So I'm like, as a kind of a Chinese institution that RAM is, like, it's really interesting that somehow you say the Dutch language is a tool that they use to fight for freedom. So I'm curious to what you think that now in a kind of Chinese space, we're using English as a method to spread this knowledge about this indigenous culture.
Thank you so much for that. That's a wonderful question. I sense also the irony of this ironic side that is maybe behind the question, and I totally all of that. There are certain problems with using specific languages in specific spaces, right? And the way it works out looks a little bit different in different historical contexts, and in this particular historical or contemporary context, it happens to look in this way. The point I was trying to work towards in the lecture, however, is that understanding of language as English being a different language, let's say, than another national language, comes with a certain concept of language that doesn't exist in a different world where language means just concepts, right? So the fact that we use English in this space, or that I'm using English in this space, I feel apologetic for that too, kind of in a way, and I don't think it's necessarily the way I would want to approach things, but since 1679, I've been caught up in a kind of railroad track, and being put on that railroad track, this is now, I am forced to use that language here in the space. So, but what I was hoping to communicate besides that is that despite that, there's still a potential for the creation of a world in which we can not see that at all, right? So we see that and we don't see that at the same time. We see that when it's necessary, and we see it when maybe in order to envision a different kind of place, in order to envision a different kind of space and future. That was a little bit abstract. I hope it.
I really like the part you say they use the language as a. Sorry if you interpret the question as such a ironic question. I really fell in love with the way you said they use the Dutch language as a method that they fight for freedom, and I think in ways that we're using this kind of globalized language also as a method to spread certain ideas that we won't usually see. I just think that I have ways of understanding how this kind of contradiction work in a complex system. That's it.
All right, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you for. Anyway, thank you for the presentation. I have a strong voice. I will give a bit of background to my question. I actually have two, if possible, but I also have some comments. So my name is Adina. I'm an environmental psychology researcher and consultant, looking at how different environments, physical, social, virtual, natural, you name it, everything that you can understand as an environment, and the influence it has on people's mindsets, behaviors, everything about humans, because we live in an interaction with the environment. It's just that different people understand it in different ways. And in the environment, for me, language is an element. And language does not only represent the words that we use. It represents a tool, a mindset, right? The way we view, and it shapes how we view the world. And language is always evolving according to the development of times. And for me, it's a kind of mutual influence. Language shaped how we view the world, but through our viewing of more things, we also shape language. So from this perspective, how would you see revitalizing a language? Because language is not only words. It's the culture, it's the times at that specific, that particular environment, and how it shaped people's minds at that time. And also a way of thinking, which is different to different languages. And the second question would be, how do you think you doing this research has shaped you as a person and the way you view the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Adina, for that question. For both those questions. So, in terms of language shaping the world, in a more than sort of like metaphorical sense, I think I am completely on board with that line of thinking, and I think the implications of that, what I was hoping to get at by just focusing on the smallest things, is that from there we can actually start to build something, a different kind of society and a different physical environment a different understanding of what is natural and what isn't natural. All of these things to kind of begin to change a very long process of knowledge formation that in my preferred terminology I would call the colonial sciences, where everything is sort of like fixed in an absolute kind of way. So yeah, changing the meaning of specific words can actually create a different kind of like architecture, a different kind of physical environment. All of that I believe in. I don't know if we can actually see the results of that in our lifetimes. I hope we will. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm.
How would you see that in the context of revitalizing the language? Because you also mentioned the UNESCO framework of
Yeah.
times. But for me, because language is not just words, it's a whole other thing that behind it that we don't see.
Mm-hmm.
But it influences how we connect to each other, how we understand the world, and so on.
Yeah. So it's easier for me to do this within, let's say, a language or culture that belongs to me. And so in that sense, even though I disagree with that way of thinking, that seems to be the way in which I have to phrase this project in order for it to be acceptable in the world. And I don't want to do that. But that's another stop in this long linear trajectory that in my story starts from 1679. But ideally, I would be able to make claims about all languages or something like that in the same kind of way. I don't know if that directly answers your question. I hope it does. But in terms of how this project shaped me, I think, what I'm presenting today is basically reflections on a lifetime as a project, and that's, again, that has something to do with acceptability in terms of the expression of ideas. But it has shaped me to my very bones, and the things I'm talking about here, I try to live that, and it's hard. That's not quite easy because there's so many contradictions that you're constantly facing as you're trying to inhabit a different kind of world while still having most of your body in this other world. So, and the fight against those contradictions, that's not fun.
Hi, Professor. I'm very curious about, since now you are in Shanghai, in China, have you done any local projects in terms of linguistics, in terms of maybe the dialects, different dialects in China? Because some of the dialects are also disappearing. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I'm super interested in exploring that from now. I haven't had the chance to do that. So I've been here now for around 6 months, and right now I have some breathing space to start new kinds of projects. But yeah, I've been hearing a lot about Shanghainese and the different forms of Shanghainese that you have across different generations of people and different groups within Shanghai itself. I'm super interested to learn more about that and maybe talk to you after this lecture or something like that and hear and learn from you in that sense. I haven't had the chance to do it myself just yet, but perhaps this could be an opportunity.
谢谢。通畅姐姐可能帮我翻译一下。对，非常感谢您的分享。为了我尽可能清楚。OK。为了我尽可能清楚地表达我的问题，我还是使用中文，就麻烦同传姐姐。第一个问题是，您在刚刚提到这个语言的转变，包括这个语言概念的转变的时候，其实一个很重要的历史背景是，比如说殖民或者更关乎权力、关乎政治这一块。我想问问您的想法，比如说您觉得这种类型的语言的概念的流变，和比如说我们说古英语到现代英语、古汉语到现代汉语这种语言的转变会有什么区别？包括你觉得这种语言内涵的变化，甚至说一些词不再被使用，一些词拥有了更多的含义，和比如说前面那个问题一样，比如说中国很多南方的方言已经由于一些城市化的原因，或者说人迁徙的原因不再被使用，很少有年轻人在使用中国南方的方言，他们都使用，他们甚至讲英语讲得比方言更好。对这种类型的语言变化和您刚刚提到的，比如说这个 Wanua 这个词的变化有什么区别？这是第一个问题。然后第二个问题是，我想问问您的观点，您觉得我们在现在是否还要去应当去对 should be 坚持去使用本土语言？例如，可能上海生活的孩子说上海话，他们或者说他们也许搬迁到另一个地方的时候，是否还需要还应该继续使用本土语言？两个问题，非常感谢。
Okay, thank you very much for that intriguing question. I want to start with maybe the last part of your question, which seems to be concerned with a policy for how we should move forward, how we should do things. And I am very reluctant to formulate a policy because I think that's why I wanted to bring today like a very personal story that I know very well and that works in that particular context because I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution for problems to do with language loss or something like that. So in terms of the difference between ancient versions of Chinese and more modern versions up until modern Chinese, and then all the different dialects that we have, if you want to transplant what I said in the lecture onto the Chinese context, then that would mean that we have to think of difference in a different way. Like what is actually different and what is actually the same. And it looks like that from my limited study, it looks like there's a lot of things that aren't very different at all. You know, we can go back, actually this understanding of modernity for myself has shifted in the recent years from thinking that it's something that started 500 years ago to further and further and further back, up until actually now it seems like that in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, where the first human civilizations, where civilization is sort of traced back to often, that's actually already where modern begins. And as I started thinking further and further, it looked like that you can even go back into the areas that are not usually called history. So realms that are studied in other disciplines, such as biology and the harder sciences, that in there you can already find some understanding of modernity present before, way before, you know, you have something like the first pyramids. So, yeah, in terms of your question of like difference, yeah, it's possible that maybe some things are not that different at all compared to on the evolutionary timescale, and that we amplify, that we magnify these differences for maybe for the wrong reasons, and this is just some rambling thinking, but thank you for that question.
不好意思，我也是需要一下同传。就是我们在做很多这些相关的研究的时候，通常会把目光投在城市，或者说更小的一个范围。但是据我所知，在上海的乡村也有很多这些历史的遗存，无论是包括海洋还是水系的。就是比如说我正在参与一个在乡村的一个项目，它也是有很多关于历史的研究。但是据我所知，很多高校的研究都是没有涉及到乡村的领域的，所以我们应该如何链接更多的人来去知晓我们拥有的这些文化遗产，然后更好的保护还有传承它。谢谢。
Thank you for that question. Let me start by saying that, as I tried to explain in the talk, this concept of the village, the concept of the tribe, as being something that we recognize. We need to sort of we need to realize that concept is maybe not stable, right? And so, actually, in the context that I'm talking about, perhaps we could already be talking about cities. That these places aren't, they look like disconnected villages that have been isolated through history, but actually connections have been going on all the time in this oceanic space. And if you go back, if you look at it from an abstract level, then some of that looks maybe like a modern city already. So in that sense, maybe I'm looking at a suburb. Maybe I'm looking at a suburb right now, and it's a suburb because why is it actually a suburb and not a center? Why do we think of it as a suburb? It has something to do with the prestige that this area has. So sometimes I joke with this archaeologist friend of mine jokingly and endearingly says that my indigenous community is an off-brand indigenous community. There have never been famous anthropological studies that have made this into a tribe that is to be remembered. So in that sense, it becomes a suburb. And I wonder if maybe there's something there that can answer your question. But it's an interesting one. And how would we tackle then getting more attention to these suburbs? Well, yeah, I think we have to consider power relations, and we have to also consider the possibility that there will always be pockets that we won't be able to know about, and that we don't want to put onto the map to know either. Because this idea of having a complete knowledge, a complete encyclopedic knowledge of the world, there's something wrong with that. And it relates to the world that is not Wanua. And I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Looks like.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, we do. Amazing.
Thank you so much for the for the wonderful talk. For a wonderful talk, I have two short questions. Like the first question is about, could you share your observation about how, what's the effort of revitalizing the indigenous language that you talk about? And the other question is about language has, just then you asked about language, right? It's like living is always changing. So I'm just wondering, the survival of the indigenous language, other than having it survive as a pure form, like the original, how about the creolization and hybridization, because cross-cultural exchanges or through conflict that you have mentioned, with Dutch, Malay, is there any example that you can give about that indigenous language that you talk about, and how maybe there would be another form, an alternative form of survival of the indigenous language? So I hope my question is clear, but thank you so much again for the wonderful talk.
Thank you for that. Okay. In terms of the efforts, the current efforts to revitalize this language specifically, there are unofficial speech contests given in schools in the area, and there is a whole social media community of people across the world that are interested in speaking this language again and using it. And so actually my father and I are part of that process, and but there is, I think all of that would fall within the older form of language revitalization that I'm trying to say that it's an older form, because it's creating, in the groups, we're making it possible to use the language to go to McDonald's, to go to Starbucks, that kind of thing. So and then order your cafe latte or something like that in Tondanese, So that's helpful for something, but not exactly for what I'm identifying as maybe a different approach to language revitalization. And that second type of work is not, that hasn't gotten underway at all yet. And in terms of this creolization and stuff, that's great that you point that out. And I actually think it's strange. It's always a little bit strange to talk about creoles and pidgin languages, I think, because that seems to be the default. So the reason why we don't see that as the default and we call it Creole language has something to do with this shift outside of Wanua, a modern view of how things work. So creolization seems to be what language, that's actually what language is, right? And there's all kinds of arbitrary reasons why some of these words in Creoles are made up and then proliferate, and it's very hard probably to completely map the process by which that happens, but it's some kind of democratic, I think, process where beauty and power comes into play, potentially, and that can be hijacked by larger hegemonic power structures to change it into national languages or something like that. That's how I would answer your question. Thank you.
Hi, I would like to build a question from the previous question on the effort of language revitalization. So upon or in your research, do you think that there are any other forms of the continuity of or the livingness of the language performed through arts and performances in Tondanese communities? So it can be anything. It can be lullaby. It can be ritual. It can be agrarian performances, like performed by elders, like in the village, or even like by the new generation of like the community.
Okay, thank you for the question. So this work that I've presented here today is part of like a larger project, and language revitalization is just one part of this, and the other part would have to do with revitalization of maybe some of the things that we could call the arts of this area. But I think there's something wrong with thinking of it as the arts of this area, because so like there's a local rice harvesting dance that has been revitalized before already in this area in the 1930s. So there was a Dutch institute called the Kruid Institute, and it tried to create the indigenous, like recreate like the indigenous dance or something like that. But the thing is that the model for that was a way of working in which work and play were not separated. So that active labor was the art. And then it's focused on, and then kind of like taken out of its context and then presented as the dance. But actually that rice harvesting dance is a rice harvesting that is it like, you know, is art because of the colonial structure that they had to produce rice for these people. So the arts were actually in all spheres of life, and the work to revitalize it in that kind of way that has not started, and perhaps there will be people in the crowd here that are interested in working with me to start that work. Thank you.
Hi, Professor. I have a question for you. So I think that with the process of urbanization, do you think that there is still a necessity that we should preserve or use the dialect in our daily lives? So, for example, in Shanghai, since there are a lot of people coming from other provinces going here for a living, so the government actually proposed that we should use Mandarin rather than the Shanghainese in our daily lives. So it seems that the function of the dialects is decreasing today. So I want to ask for your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. So I think it follows another question that came earlier in terms of like how we should deal with problems of language loss in the city context and the contemporary context. For example, here in Shanghai, and should we continue to use the dialects even though the higher powers are telling us not to? I think there will be. I'm hesitant to say we should or we shouldn't. I think it will work out naturally. And because the way I think that the power of the dialect lies not in its specific form as it exists, that in the way that we use it. It's something a little bit more hidden. So you can speak the dialect even if you're speaking Mandarin, if that makes sense. So you can use the dialect, the ideas of the dialect, as you're using Mandarin. I think in that way, it doesn't matter what what people say you should or shouldn't do. Thank you.
Do we have any final questions?
How Professor, I wonder if you know, in 1930s, the Bund had a Shanghai Yacht Club, and later it moved to Minhong. Now it's outside the urban areas. And our group has a history researcher called Edward, and he found there was a yacht built in 1911 in Shanghai. And now we are planning to bring it back to Shanghai. So if you have any interest to cooperate with us, and we are very welcome to some cooperation. Okay.
Thank you for that invitation. I'll look into it. I haven't heard of this before, but yeah, please share some information after the talk. Whatever you had.
就是我们有一个微信公众号，我就打个广告，有一个微信公众号是 Off Bound 外滩之外，它这里其实是一个微信公众号，你可以搜一下，就是叫 Off Bound。我们现在之前结束了一个叫 Let Water Flows， 就是让水一直流的一个展。我们这个项目就是对当时这个 Yacht Club 进行了一定的研究，想要把它打造成一个可持续的项目。有兴趣的话可以来看看。
Hi. So my question is in regard to the formation of a new language. I'm curious about your study of the birth of a new language in suburb areas. Like in China in 1950s or 60s, there are many new districts being built near the suburb areas, and people from different provinces or cities go to this area and then gradually form a new language with a new dialect, or I would say new dialect. So what's your opinion about the formation of that? Because it's very, like within 10 years or 20 years, a new dialect was formed. So have you studied something like that?
Thank you for that question. So what I was talking about today, I'm trying to propose a different understanding of what language is, and I think new languages, that's, you know, the fact that they are birthed and that they come into being and that they are born, that's nature. I think that's nature, and so and the dying of languages actually too, right? And it happens in much smaller spaces than the national unit, and much smaller spaces than the city unit. So yeah, I think I have no opinion about the birth of new languages other than that I think that's just how things are, yeah. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm afraid that's going to be the last question because at 4 o'clock we have Philistine and Nova presenting their documentary performance, Activism, which is presenting this project called Arca Kinari that is so linked to what Manny just presented in terms of language, and also the context too, because Arca Kinari is this ship that is registered in the Netherlands, and Philistine and Nova taken on this ship and use it as a performance platform. They sail the ship across the Pacific, meeting people from different places and islands, and when the ship is not sailing, they dock it in Indonesia and inviting local groups and also artists to come and perform on the ship. And to relate it back to language, arca is a Latin word meaning to defend, and kinari is a Sanskrit word that is representing a half human, half bird musician that is guarding the tree of life. So on that regard, yeah, please do come back at 4 o'clock for the performance. Thank you so much, Manny, and thank you everyone. And I'm sure Manny will stick around if anybody has more questions for him. Thank you.